The Great Boston Molasses Flood of 1919. The Dark Tide, a tsunami of sweetness in Boston, 1919. The Hook. It was the 5th day of January 1919 in the bustling north end of Boston, Massachusetts. The air, typically biting and frigid in a New England winter, had warmed to a bizarre, almost spring-like 40 degrees Fahrenheit, or 4 degrees Celsius. Children were playing hooky in the streets, workers were enjoying an unseasonably pleasant lunch break, and life was moving at the brisk, confident pace of America on the cusp of a new era. World War I was over, and the future smelled of opportunity. But that future, it turned out, would also smell overwhelmingly of molasses. At 12:41 p.m., the tranquility of Commercial Street was shattered, not by a bomb, not by an earthquake, but by a sound that witnesses would later describe as a deep, metallic roar, like a machine gun drum or a freight train ripping through a station. In the middle of the crowded docklands, an industrial steel tank, 50 feet high and 90 feet wide, storing 2.3 million gallons of dark, heavy syrup, exploded. In an instant, a wave of sticky brown fluid, a veritable tsunami of molasses, erupted, surging through the streets at an astonishing speed of 35 miles per hour, 56 kilometers per hour. This was not a slow, sweet spill. This was a force of nature, a 25-foot or 8-meter-high wall of fermented sugar carrying a crushing weight of 14,000 tons. It possessed 4 times the density of water. The molasses wave slammed into the densely populated neighborhood with catastrophic power. It snapped the steel girders of the elevated railway, crushed the Engine 31 firehouse, swept entire homes off their foundations, and suffocated men, women, children, and horses where they stood. The United States had just defeated the German Empire, but on this tragic day, the people of Boston's North End were utterly defeated by sugar. This is the true story of the Great Molasses Flood, a disaster born not of nature or war, but of corporate greed, structural negligence, and a terrifying combination of physics and industrial sugar. It is the story of a sweet wave that turned into a sticky, impossible nightmare, and the landmark legal battle that fundamentally changed American corporate accountability forever. Part 1. The Tank and the Tide of Industry. The Sweet Empire. The story begins not with disaster, but with profit, and the rise of the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, USIA, during the fervor of World War I. World War I demanded vast quantities of industrial alcohol, or ethanol, for the manufacture of smokeless gunpowder and other munitions. Molasses, a cheap and abundant byproduct of sugar refining, was the primary ingredient. To meet the insatiable demand, USIA formed a subsidiary, the Purity Distilling Company, and began construction of a gargantuan storage tank at 529 Commercial Street on the Boston waterfront in 1915. The location was strategic, right on the pier to receive shipments from the Caribbean, and right next to the train tracks to whisk the processed product, industrial alcohol, to the munitions factories across the country. But the location was also disastrously negligent. It sat directly amidst the densely packed, working-class immigrant community of the North End, a neighborhood of narrow, winding streets and closely built wooden tenements. A colossus of questionable quality. The tank itself was a monument to haste and corner-cutting. When it was built, it was a colossal structure, 50 feet high and over 90 feet wide, holding enough molasses to fill 3 Olympic swimming pools. But from the moment of its construction, it was plagued with problems. Arthur Gell, the treasurer of Purity Distilling and the man in charge of the tank's construction, was not an engineer. He hired inexperienced, low-paid workers and rushed the job. The steel plates used for the tank walls were reportedly thinner than specified, and the quality of the rivets, the critical fasteners holding the whole structure together, was appalling. Witnesses later testified that when the tank was filled for the first time, it groaned and creaked ominously. Locals noticed the terrifying signs immediately. The enormous tank, perpetually filled to the brim with molasses, leaked. Children in the neighborhood began collecting the seepage, dipping bread into the sweet runoff, a small treat earned from a dangerous flaw. The dark, sticky trails flowed down Commercial Street and collected around the tank's base. When citizens complained to USIA about the leaks and the unsettling noises, the company's dismissive response was telling. They merely ordered the tank to be painted brown, hoping to hide the oozing molasses from view. The problem was not the leak. The problem was that people could see the leak. The chemistry of catastrophe. Molasses is not water. It is heavy, dense, and viscous. Its density is about 1.4 metric tons per cubic meter, 40% heavier than water. This massive weight exerted an enormous outward pressure on the tank walls. Expert engineering analysis would later reveal that the steel used in the tank, barely 9/16 inch thick, was being subjected to internal stresses of 31,000 pounds per square inch, or 210 megapascals, nearly double the maximum safe stress level recommended for the material. The winter of 1919 was harsh, followed by that inexplicable rapid thaw on January 15th. The day before, a fresh shipment of molasses, recently warmed to decrease its viscosity for transfer, had been pumped into the structurally compromised tank, pushing it past its breaking point. The molasses inside was undergoing slow fermentation, a process that releases carbon dioxide gas. This gas, trapped inside the nearly full tank, increased the internal pressure even further, especially as the sudden temperature spike activated the fermentation process. It was a ticking bomb of sugar and shoddy construction, waiting for the one final lethal variable to tip it into catastrophe. Part 2. The Wave and the Wreckage. The roar and the rush. The explosion, when it came at 12:41 p.m., was not a slow rupture. The lowest, weakest plate of the enormous steel cylinder gave way entirely. The fracture was total, releasing the 2.3 million gallons of molasses with a violent, instantaneous force that defied imagination. The wave that burst forth was colossal. Eyewitnesses described it as a dark, brown wall, initially estimated to be 25 feet high. It did not splash, it surged, a living, heavy entity, moving at 35 miles per hour. The sound of the initial rupture gave way to the terrifying crush of impact. The wave's first victim was the Engine 31 firehouse. The two-story brick building was completely obliterated. The structure was not merely damaged, it was picked up, twisted, and thrown from its foundation. 8 firemen, eating lunch inside, were caught completely unaware. Several were killed instantly. Next came the elevated train tracks of the Atlantic Avenue line. The molasses hit the steel supports with such force that it bent the massive load-bearing steel girders and pushed a streetcar completely off the track. The motorman, seeing the impossible wave approaching, was able to slam on the brakes just in time, saving his passengers, but watching the world outside turn brown. A landscape of sticky death. The impact on the human victims was horrifying. The molasses was not only heavy, but it was also viscous, trapping and suffocating its victims. The accounts are grisly. Stephen Clafferty, a teamster, was swept up with his horses. The animals, strong and panicked, were instantly buried and crushed, their frantic movements only churning the molasses into a deeper, stickier quicksand. Pasquale Iantosca, a 10-year-old boy, was flung from a street corner into a light pole by the sheer force of the tide. Many died from the sheer kinetic energy of the impact, suffering crushed skulls and broken limbs as they were slammed into debris and buildings. But for the vast majority, the cause of death was drowning and suffocation in the thick, unyielding syrup. Within moments, the entire neighborhood was transformed into a grotesque disaster zone. The molasses, cooling rapidly in the frigid air, quickly solidified. What started as a fast-moving liquid became a semi-solid bog stretching across 2 city blocks. The recovery effort was a nightmare. Part 3. The Nightmare of Rescue. The sticky quagmire. The sheer novelty of the disaster paralyzed the initial response. How do you rescue people from a flood of molasses? Rescuers, police, firemen who survived, Cadets from the nearby training ship USS Nantucket and ordinary citizens rushed to the scene. But the molasses had settled into a glutinous mass, making every step a monumental effort. Rescuers found themselves sinking up to their hips. Hoses, normally used to spray water, were useless against the sticky, cement-like consistency. The molasses absorbed light, making it difficult to see where victims lay buried. For the trapped victims, the cold was excruciating. They were submerged in cold, sticky fluid, accelerating the onset of shock and hypothermia. The sounds of the rescue were marked by the sucking noise of boots being pulled from the mire and the panicked cries of people buried alive. Firemen started using the only thing that worked. They flooded the area with seawater, which was freezing cold, but which slowly dissolved the molasses, allowing them to wade deeper into the wreckage. The cleanup effort required nearly 87,000 man-hours over the next 2 weeks. In the end, 21 people were killed and 150 were injured. The death toll included firemen, children, laborers, and a range of local residents. Dozens of horses were killed, their agonizing struggles only burying them deeper. The bodies recovered were coated so thickly in the syrup that they were difficult to identify, an eerie, sticky coating that defied the dignity of the dead. The disaster left an indelible mark on Boston. Molasses was tracked everywhere, onto subway platforms, into phone booths, and deep into homes. For months afterwards, the entire North End smelled sickeningly sweet, a cloying odor that served as a constant, dreadful reminder of the tragedy. Part 4. The Trial and the Price of Negligence. The Search for Blame. In the immediate aftermath, USIA, the parent company of Purity Distilling, sought desperately to deflect blame. Their first claim was the most sensational and bizarre. The tank, they argued, had been deliberately blown up by anarchists or Bolsheviks. In the post-war Red Scare environment, this was a plausible, fear-mongering defense designed to shift public anger from corporate failure to political extremism. However, the victims and their families were not fooled. They filed one of the first major American class action lawsuits against the corporation. The legal battle, the USIA Company versus Massachusetts Consolidated Street Railway Company and hundreds of other plaintiffs, lasted for 5 years. The complexity of the case demanded a new level of forensic investigation. The court appointed Colonel Hugh W. Ogden as auditor to oversee the investigation. Colonel Ogden, a former colonel in the Spanish-American War, embarked on an exhaustive, technical inquiry. The key to the trial was the brilliant testimony of Professor Charles M. Spofford, the head of civil engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. Professor Spofford meticulously examined the fragments of the collapsed tank which had been recovered from the molasses-soaked debris. His findings were damning. Under design, Spofford calculated that the tank walls, even if built with perfect materials, were only strong enough to safely hold half the volume of molasses that was regularly pumped into it. Faulty materials. Laboratory tests on the steel plates showed they were structurally weak, lacking the necessary manganese content to be resilient. Rivet failure. The most critical failure was the riveting. Spofford discovered that the rivet holes had not been properly aligned, meaning the rivets were subjected to massive shear forces. The holes had likely been punched rather than drilled, a cheaper, faster, but drastically weaker method of construction. The constant groaning the neighbors heard was the sound of the rivets tearing out of the brittle, thin steel. Spofford's testimony effectively debunked the anarchist theory. It was not a bomb, but a fundamental failure of engineering and construction. The disaster was not an act of war, but a direct consequence of USIA prioritizing speed and profit over human life and safety. The landmark ruling. In 1925, after 5 years of testimony, scientific analysis, and emotional recountings of the horror, Colonel Ogden rendered his final verdict. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company was solely responsible for the disaster. The company, finally forced to face the overwhelming evidence of their negligence, was ordered to pay a massive settlement to the victims and their families, estimated at around $600,000, which is equivalent to millions of dollars today. The Great Molasses Flood became one of the first major cases in U.S. jurisprudence to assign liability based on scientific and engineering testimony, setting a profound precedent. It forever changed the way construction projects were overseen in Massachusetts and eventually across the country. It mandated that engineers and architects must sign and approve building plans, that proper inspections must be performed, and that corporations could no longer hide behind layers of legal bureaucracy to escape accountability for lethal negligence. Part 5. The Legacy of the Sweet Scar. The Scars of the North End. Today, the site of the Great Molasses Flood is a baseball field and part of a park right next to the modern Boston waterfront. But the strange, impossible memory of the disaster persists. For decades after, on hot summer days, the people of the North End swore they could still smell the cloying, sickly sweet scent of molasses rising from the street, as if the earth itself retained the traumatic memory of that dark, sticky tide. The story of the Great Molasses Flood is astonishing precisely because it sounds like black comedy, a disaster of ludicrous proportions involving sugar, but the reality was a tragedy of immense human suffering and corporate callousness. It is a story that resonates deeply with the American experience, encompassing the immigrant experience. The victims were predominantly Italian and Irish immigrants, the working class of Boston, whose lives were deemed less valuable by the powerful corporation cutting corners in their neighborhood. Corporate power versus public safety. It serves as a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked industrial power and the necessity of structural regulation. The triumph of science and law. The victory was ultimately won by the rigorous, meticulous application of civil engineering and forensic science in a court of law, ensuring that technical facts could hold even the largest corporations accountable. The Great Molasses Flood is a uniquely American disaster, a tragic combination of massive scale, technological failure, immigrant history, and a landmark legal battle that, however bizarre the catalyst, forever shaped the landscape of corporate responsibility in the United States. It is the story of the day Boston was flooded by sweetness and learned a bitter, indelible lesson.